Beyond the Gates spoilers for Thursday, September 25, 2025 tease that the night air is heavy with humidity that makes the windshield wipers drag like tired arms on glass, a thick, low consistency that sticks to the mouth and makes thinking sluggish. Doug feels it like a pressure behind his eyes, a swelling discomfort that comes not just from the alcohol in his stomach but also from the slow, terrible realization of betrayal that has hollowed out the day. Vanessa is with Joey now. Vanessa was with Joey now. That sentence rubbed at him like sand in a wound, and the revelation was a complicated fracture, more than a broken trust. It was an exposure. Every private image he had ever carried of his life, the small victories in family, the quiet, the illusion of mutual patience, lays in pieces on the bar floor where he had collapsed into the last bottle as if drinking could erase the image of them in each other's arms. He had not meant to drive. Doug knew that even in the unsteady ballet of his thoughts. He knew it in that way people who have already gambled with ruin know when to quit and do not. But he had left. Stumbling out into the parking lot, the world slurring at the edges, he told himself he was only going to clear his head. He got behind the wheel because leaving felt like surrendering, and there was a small, furious part of him that wanted to punish the world by not caring about it. The ignition sounded like a gunshot to someone else. To Doug it was the sound of inevitability. June stood on the sidewalk near the old diner where Samantha worked part-time while she finished classes. The two women had been saying the kind of things that people say when words are inadequate repetitions of "be careful." The hollow comfort of small instructions, and June's hands had been on Samantha's shoulders the way they always were, palms that had steadied a lifetime of missteps. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, that ritual blessing of a parent who knows the weather of the world is rough but believes in the existence of soft places. Samantha, at 19, had the rough energy of youth and the waywardness of hope. She pulled back with a grin that didn't reach her eyes and promised to be home early. June watched her go, counting footsteps, counting time, a tiny litany. She did not see the car that snaked into the flow of the street like a loose animal, its lights a double blink in the haze. From a distance, Doug's car looked like any other, headlamps like weary moons, the city reflected in the hood like a watery painting. Up close, everything was less noble. The steering vibrated under his hands in a rhythm that mocked his heartbeat. He felt the car sway and corrected, or thought he did. For someone drunk, reflexes are cowed animals, choices compress until there's only reaction. He heard a shout. It could have been the wind. It could have been an old joke. It was not. The sound that split the night like a seam was a scream. Samantha's, a sharp, animal note that sent his fingers gripping desperately at the wheel. June's brain worked in two modes at once, a flash of muscle memory and a surge of maternal panic. She saw the line of the car veer, a wrongness in its angle, and she saw Samantha frozen on the curb. Without thinking, June shoved Samantha backward with a force that scattered the chair of years behind them. The world slowed in the exact instant her daughter moved and the car didn't. June's foot found asphalt in a way that toe and heel suddenly belonged to separate stories. She fell. The sound of impact was not cinematic but intimate and obscene. The sick, personal thump of flesh on metal, the small, ragged cry of someone who has been cleaved from ordinary life. Samantha's scream was a fissure. People near the diner turned. Someone called 911 with a voice that sounded like it belonged to a different life. Doug's hands trembled as he killed the engine, the sudden silence as sharp as a slap. He saw June slumped on the road, an unnatural stillness, the color of blood bright like a warning flag. For a minute he could only stare. Then the world closed in with the sound of sneakers and the smell of oil and the metallic tang that rose up from the wound. He staggered out of the car and stood paralyzed between the rhythmic sirens that began to grow and the stunned faces that formed a ring around June like a crude altar. The ambulance cut through the night with a urgency that made even the air seem to hurry. Jacob arrived at the scene like something inevitable. He'd been drawn there, maybe by the sirens, maybe by the sense of obligation that had always governed him. He had known June since childhood. He had the sturdy, straightforward face of someone who keeps score in acts rather than in affections. At the curb he saw Naomi collapse in a heap, a woman whose life had always been a fragile architecture of hope and fear, and as he lifted her, He understood that the small community had become a magnet for disaster. Paramedics worked with methodical tenderness. They bundled June into the ambulance, the stretcher creaking like an old door. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a treacherous lift. Samantha clung to her mother's hand, nails white against skin. Doug stood a few feet away, hands at his sides, the smell of whiskey still sweet in the air around him, eyes blown wide with a double knowledge that he had caused this, and that even if it were not his entirely, he would be the one to live with the stain. He was taken later, too, bandaged, head throbbing, consciousness foggy, handcuffs never placed but officers hovering like vultures, their presence a legal punctuation. News spreads in small towns like a fever. Samantha's call to her two fathers and to Naomi June's been hit was a code that cracked open the evening. Naomi could not stand on her own. Vanessa, when Jacob told her, dropped everything, his voice, a dry and professional thing, delivered the news, and Vanessa's world snapped into a direction that rewired her priorities. She drove home in a blur, speeding but with the same precise control she used on negotiations that paid her rent. Joey, when he heard, felt a thin, private joy. He was a man of appetite and industry. Doug had been the one obstacle between him and a certain kind of ascendancy. He did not plan murder, at least not in the straightforward way one imagines, but when the universe nudged possibilities into his palm, he did not stop to check whether they were clean or tainted. The question hung in the air like exhaust: was this an accident born only of drunk foolishness, or was something more deliberate at work? In the small town where stories accumulate into hard truths, suspicion never begins as certainty. It simmers into it. Someone suggested the possibility of tampered brakes, a rumor first whispered by a neighbor who knew engines better than people. Another said the car had swerved as if it had been pushed. People watched Joey closely in the hours that followed, measuring his pauses for guilt, his quick return to the business of living for signs of a guilty conscience. Vanessa moved like someone threading a needle through a storm, each movement precise, each word measured. She had not wanted Doug dead. She had loved him with the brittle, complicated ways of people whose lives are woven together by necessity and coercion. But love, in any neat form, had long since been eaten away by other things. June had always been combustion more than stillness. She could take a room by the force of her laughter and bandage someone else's bleeding without thinking. She had raised Samantha with a ferocious protection bred of fear and tenderness in equal measure. That same tendency, to throw herself between harm and her child, saved Samantha that night. But the violence done to June was a small cosmic verdict, a judgment that changed calendars. In the hospital, under the white light that made skin look both precious and fragile, doctors spoke in tones of technical calm. Stable for now. We need to operate. Their phrases were parentheses, holding a life suspended between before and after. Doug sat on the edge of a plastic chair in a room where the clocked hands seemed accusatory. He had been given time to think, to consider the slow machinery of consequence. The police stood by the door like fixed stars. He felt the double weight of remorse and the small, aching need to rationalize. He could have, from that moment, taken the simplest path, admitted his fault and let the law be the measure. But shame is a cunning thing. It arranges justifications like props on a stage. If he had been sober, if he had turned the wheel differently, then perhaps this would not be. And yet the possibility of conspiracy lodged in his mind like a seed. What if someone had wanted him out of the way? Wasn't it plausible? The brain seeks absolution as the body seeks sleep. Naomi's collapse at the scene was the first in a chain of unraveling. She had been the steady, diffident kind of mother who staged her life for other people's needs. The sight of her on the asphalt, sobbing, clawing toward June's still body, made people uncomfortable in the clean way hospitals make people uncomfortable. The emergency room filled with family: Jacob, who had arrived like an anchor; Vanessa, who hovered at the periphery with the sharpness of someone who could not break down in public; Joey, who came in with a briefcase and a face like a man who had been told to look solemn. Samantha cried with the rawness of a child who had survived and watched her parent almost die. She clenched and unclenched her fingers, memorizing the hospital's smells, the antiseptic and the faint perfume of other people's grief. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Someone claimed they'd seen a figure in the alley who'd waved before the car swerved. Another insisted the crash had the fingerprints of deliberate sabotage, a cut brake line, a pressure release. But then the word sabotage was only someone's attempt to make meaning out of catastrophe. The police collected statements, time, position, light conditions, alcohol estimates. Forensics would later scrape paint, gather fibers, photograph skid marks. At night, images of tire tracks and the angle of the impact would be discussed in whispers. Did Doug try to brake? Did the car lurch once the driverless movement began? The evidence, objective as it tried to be, would later be read through the lens of everyone's biases. Vanessa paced in the hallway with the phone pressed to her ear, her voice thin. She had not wanted this violence for Doug, not that kind, and yet the fact of it loosened something in her that had been bound by fear and necessity. She had been living a double life, existing with Doug in a house that contained small domestic armor and with Joey in a world that promised power and protection. Her betrayal was not malevolent germination so much as a desperate plan to secure a different future, one where debts were paid and safety real. When Jacob told her June had been injured, something quick slipped across her face, fear or calculation, an indistinguishable blink in the ambulance light. She paid for the quickness of her reactions in the hours afterward when looking at Doug felt like reading a letter from a past life. Joey reacted with a predatory equanimity. In the days he'd spent moving pieces on a board, leveraging business deals, nudging contracts, whispering promises, he had acquired enemies and allies. Marcel Malone, a name that tasted of oil and money, was the kind of facilitator who turned murky wishes into actions. People like him varnish guilt with plausible deniability. If someone with nerve and opportunity wanted a man off the board, they could arrange the circumstances. But on that rain-softened street, conspiracy was speculation. The facts would eventually have to follow. June's surgery would stretch for hours and seem both instantaneous and cosmic to those who waited. In the fold of the hospital corridor, vamping light, every minute elongated into an hour. People who had been strangers passed offerings on the way, a cup of coffee, a cigarette stub, a prayer. The surgeon's hands were professional and small in the enormous task of rearranging human fate. When finally he emerged, his mouth a muttered map of procedure, the words he used were careful. Critical, he said. We've stabilized some things, but there's ongoing bleeding. He did not say, and could not say, the full measure of what would happen. That is the cruelty and the mercy of medicine. It restores and it admits there are limits. Doug's head throbbed with a dull, pulsing realization that the night had escalated into consequences he might never outrun. He had believed, in those bored and biting months, that the world could be manipulated with enough bravado, enough small lies. He had not counted on the stubbornness of ordinary lives. Blood met tissue, emergency rooms stitched and prayed, police forms filed the day into a ledger that would be returned to later and examined like a lost map. People gathered in the waiting room like personal tragedies trying on one another's faces. There were looks of accusation aimed at Doug that he could feel like sharp stones. He thought of Vanessa and wondered if any part of her regret would find him in the fluorescent room. Samantha, who had been both saved and scarred in a single breath, sat on a countertop, knees tucked, eyes hollowed. She replayed the seconds on a loop, her mother's small shove, the sound of the engine, the way the world rearranged and tried to map cause from effect. The town, a living organism of small congregations and more minor cruelties, began to choose sides and assign motives. Naomi, drifted between collapse and prayer, demanded to know who should be held accountable. People wanted certainty because certainty is a kind of comfortable cruelty. The more one can name a villain, the more one can sleep. And yet, within the contemplations of the night, a more unnerving thought slithered toward the surface. Who gains if Doug is removed? Joey does, in a narrow sense, He could move into the spaces left by hurt like a tide. Marcel gains if his services are rendered. Vanessa's love life would be reconfigured. But human plans are unpredictable, meant to be bent by the stubbornness of human bodies and the small randomness of fate. The possibility of orchestration bloomed into the imaginations of people like mold in damp corners, a small growth that could spread and color the entire narrative. Before the day could settle into a verdict, there were smaller scenes that mattered. A nurse who had seen Doug once before in a different, happier time when he'd been younger and clumsier and loved watched him with a human distaste. Jacob made arrangements with the hospital, staying by June's bed and keeping a ledger of calls. Vanessa, in the upstairs of her house, collapsed into a chair and dialed Joey, a private, panicked conversation that contained both calculation and pleading. The call would be traced. Of course, an item on a record that an investigator could later pull, but in the hours that followed, nothing was yet certain beyond June's fragile survival. There was a small witness, a teenage boy who plied the late-night coffee stand and whose memory was sharp with the night's detail. He claimed to have seen a figure on the sidewalk seconds before the car veered. Someone who had been near the curb and then gone. The statement was the kind of detail that could be strong as needlework or as tenuous as a cloud. Police logged it. Someone scribbled it into a notebook and then put the notebook on a desk. The world required evidence. Doug heard a voice echoing hollowly in his head as the night passed into an exhausted dawn. You are the one who chose to drink. You are the one who took the wheel. There was truth there that hit him like a match. And yet the tender little predator of doubt tugged at the edge of his mind. What if someone else had intervened? What if a hand had guided the wheel? It is always easier to shoulder blame than to confront the possibility of being a pawn in someone else's game. He thought of Joey's smile, of the way Joey's presence had tightened around Vanessa like a belt. June, in the operating room, hovered on the edge of consciousness where thoughts are dream scraps and memory is flung into loose corners. She saw Samantha's face. She felt the weight of a hand on her wrist. She did not know yet that her future would be raw with rehabilitation, with little triumphs that would cost her everything. She had always been a person of movement, of doing, and now the doing would be a physical act of building herself back from a hill of rubble. The night kept its secrets and let out only a slow trickle of details. The only clear lights were the ones that tried to stitch a life back together. As dawn bled into the city, the question that would push everyone into action congealed. Was this pure accident, incompetent and devastating, or the result of a plan? An investigator would later trace tire tracks and examine the brake pedal and listen to the last words Doug had slurred before blacking out. They would watch security footage that the diner had on its back wall, a small green camera that recorded the street in a grainy, indifferent loop. For now, the town waited with the impatience and intensity of people who are asking whether an ordinary fragile life could be unmade by the greed and maneuvering of a few. The night had forged a fracture in the community, a seam that would be pulled through the days to come. People shifted, alliances reformed, old debts reappeared as if calling themselves by name. The event had a moral pull, a gravity that turned everyone's moral compasses. At the center of it, Saturday, June, a woman who had pushed her child away from death and taken that death in her stead. The question the night left suspended above the hospital beds and the kitchen tables was not simply whether she would live, but whether the life she returned to would be the same as the life she had left, whether the town would allow the narrative to be closed as an accident, or whether someone would pry that lid off and look for fingerprints. In the sterile fold of the emergency room, someone finally closed the door to the operating theater with a soft, decisive click, the small sound of an eventful machinery moving on. Outside, the dawn slicked the streets, worn and quieter now. The sheriff made a note in his pad and thumbed the paper like a man arranging a puzzle he did not yet understand. Vanessa sat with her palms pressed together, whispering things that sounded on the edge of prayer. Joey walked back out into the gray morning with a look of a man making the calculus of whether to be careful or bold. At the cliff of uncertainty, human beings stretch and yawn in long ways, making themselves smaller or larger to fit the shape of the hole left by chaos. The narrative had only begun. The hospital lights hummed like a persistent insect. In a small room, Doug pressed his forehead to his knees and wept for the life he had wrecked. Somewhere else, someone else might have been making a plan. And somewhere, A camera recorded the minute details of a street at night, its footage unexamined and waiting like a truth that had not yet found its voice. The question of culpability, of whether this was an accident forged from pity and alcohol or a stroke of skulking, organized malevolence, would unspool across the days that followed. Until that unspooling, the town existed between two breaths, one that it had held before the crash, and one it could not yet release. The morning after the night of shame and sirens, protective, limping toward daily obligations that suddenly seemed both trivial and urgent. June's name traveled through the grapevine of people, whispered in salons, repeated with a hollow faraway quality at the hardware store, used as a litany in the church. The hospital room where she remained was a small theater of vigilance. Machines kept gentle rhythm, their beeps a music of precarious continuance. Samantha kept vigil at her mother's bedside like someone who had learned to translate fear into action. She smoothed hair gently, spoke of things banal and brave, laid her head against June's hand as if trying to merge two separate histories. Detectives arrived with suitcases of tools and the quiet demeanor of people who collect facts to triple lock a story. They moved through the scene with the kind of patience that keeps the world from falling into worse chaos. Tires were measured. Photographs were taken. The camera from the diner was pulled from its mount and plugged into a laptop. The footage grainy, the night recorded in jagged segments. It was in that playback, slowed and watched with the concentration of surgeons, that eyes first caught a small, bright motion, a flash of movement on the sidewalk a split second before the car veered. A figure, perhaps delivering something, perhaps just passing by. The image was little more than a suggestion, a smear in the dark. But in towns like this, suggestion becomes a seed. Dudley in a different bed, bandaged and sullen, the taste of copper and regret in his mouth. He remembered enough to know his culpability and not enough to be sure of all the details. His memory had pinked at the edges like burned paper. In the police interview room, he spoke haltingly. "I drank," he said. "I drove." That admission settled over the room like a stone. But even as he said it, his mind reached back to the flicker on the sidewalk. The question of whether a conspiracy had fanned its fingers into the night's cold remained a burning ember. He would later learn that Joanne, a waitress with a steady memory and a better camera phone than the town knew, had taken a photo of a man loitering near the curb. The image would have to be enhanced, scrutinized, turned over like a coin, before it could be trusted. Vanessa's life, meanwhile, was a series of emails and interrupted conversations. She moved like someone trying to be both partner and conspirator outwardly, fatherly, and private inwardly. She feared Doug's slow unraveling and also feared that his presence was an anchor dragging her hopes into dark water. Her relationship with Joey had been an attempt at a new foothold. She had not expected it to require either murder or an arrangement in which she convinced herself that the moral ledger could be balanced. In the privacy of her car, she cried. But there were other parts of her that calculated lawyers to call, a delicate choreography of statements to make so that she would not appear compromising. Moreover, the knowledge that the crash had changed everything for Samantha and Naomi punched at her like the memory of a renewed promise broken. Joey, for his part, tried to disassociate. He walked into a cafe with the kind of charm that had gotten him far in life and smiled at people whose illusions he helped manage. But he also had a hand in obtaining favors from people who worked in the shadows, men who could make an accident look like an accident. Marcel Malone's name resurfaced in negotiation after negotiation. He was the sort of man who runs an idea through multiple hands until it becomes something actionable. He was not always physically present at events, but his fingerprints, metaphorical and sometimes literal, could be found in the kinds of deals that do not show on a ledger. If someone had wanted Doug removed, Marcel could source the method. The question, always, was motive and degree. The family's grief coalesced into a plan. Jacob organized shifts at June's bedside. Naomi oscillated between irrational panic and a reconstitution of everyday chores, as if by keeping cups washed she could ward off tragedy. Samantha needed to go back to school but found herself unable to sit in class. In the hospital corridor, a small battle formed over information. Who would tell Sam the tests were inconclusive? Who could bear to speak the worst words aloud? Each person carved out a little ritual of control. Tiara the nurse promised a regular update. A neighbor left a casserole. Someone else offered to sit with Samantha. Life, somehow, continued. Then there was the evidence that would sear the narrative into another shape. Forensics recovered a sliver of fabric jammed beneath the car door hinge. A synthetic fiber dyed a particular cheap black, with a faint smear of grease and a small trace of serial engraving on its edge. In isolation, it was a curious object. Together with a blurred image of a figure in the diner camera, these details became more than an accident's flotsam. The fiber, when run through a database, matched a type of work glove used by a company that serviced vehicles, one that had been contracted in the town for odd jobs. The contract records were thin, but they led to a name: Malone Contracting, a business not wholly legitimate, and not wholly criminal, with links to Marcel Malone's broader interests. When Detective Reyes showed up at Malone Contracting under the pretense of asking about a routine job, the man in the office who answered was all smiles and oily hands. He knew how to make nervousness into a commodity. He told the detective that their gloves had been misplaced months ago. They used a variant of the brand and they'd had an employee who liked to leave them in odd places. The story was a small one, but the detective, with a patience gilded by the boredom of small towns, kept asking questions about who else had access to Malone's storeroom, about recent deliveries, about bar tabs. On the third day, a delivery manifest surfaced where a truck had gone to a storage unit with a name that overlapped with a shell corporation owned by a man who used to be seen with Marcel at the docks. Vanessa's phone logs were another hinge. A detective subpoenaed them, and what they found was a series of late-night messages between Vanessa and Joey. The content was not violent, but the cadence suggested coordination, locations and times, veiled references to meetings. There was nothing that said arrange an accident, but there was a trail of communication that suggested someone was preparing for a change. When questioned, Joey explained with practiced innocence, he had reason to contact Vanessa, he said, for business reasons. People who lie often do not sound convincing because they are rehearsed. But Joey had rehearsed more than a little. His shoulders were practiced in the pose of control. Doug's memory, however, proved the more dangerous fulcrum. In the eat and wait span of his convalescence, dozing in the antiseptic light, he woke up with a single image pinned to the back of his consciousness: a gloved hand, near the wheel, a metallic shine. He could not trust his memory entirely. Alcohol distorts and fractures, but certain things have a stubbornness to them. He told the detective, in a voice that was as small and honest as he could make it, that he thought someone had been near the car as he drove. If he was right, then this had shifted from accident to the realm of crime. Confrontation, when it came in 1,000 small ways rather than in a single dramatic act. Vanessa found herself on the edge of confession. She had not wanted to catalyze murder, she had only wanted to secure a life. The sight of June's blood spat upon the cold asphalt had loosened in her the necessary illusions. In a small private conversation with Jacob, she said, "I didn't mean," but she could not finish. Whether she had the courage to reveal the full truth, or whether she would shelter herself and Joey under thin layers of plausible deniability, became a moral question that threatened to undo her. The town watched as the legal mechanism of suspicion tightened: subpoenas, search warrants, a careful mapping of who had been where. Detective Reyes was patient to the point of crucible, assembling small pieces into a puzzle. He believed, in a way that made it his personal obsession, that truth had a habit of announcing itself if one kept enough lights on. He pulled credit card receipts and matched them with gas station camera footage. He found a pattern of late-night trips by a van registered under Malone-associated entities to the area near the diner. Each new discovery did not feel like a crack but an incremental polish on a lens through which truth finally came into focus. But in the middle of this methodical progress, life's messiness intervened. Marcel Malone was not a man who surrendered easily. He moved like someone who understood that the appearance of force is sometimes enough to quiet an investigation. He had friends in the right places and money that greased hands. He responded by threatening people who knew too much. A mechanic who had been in the storage unit found his tires slashed and a note under the wiper blade telling him to keep his mouth shut. These were the conversations of a town learning the cost of peering into the shadows. Samantha, who had survived June's sacrifice, carried more than physical scars. At night she replayed the event and rewound it backwards to try to understand whether an intervention would have changed things. She woke with a newfound ferocity. She vowed, private and fierce, to not let the truth be buried. There is an astonishing resolve that blooms in young people who have seen the world's sinew. They either bend under it or become something more precise. Samantha chose precision. She began to collate messages, receipts, buttons of clothing, things people overlook but which make a lawman's job easier later. The hospital tests, the forensic reports, the late-night camera tapes all began to line up like a map. Slowly, painfully, it took shape. A man who had motive, resources, and the kind of arrogance that leads to risky moves, small accomplices who were used to do his bidding, a victim who was drunk and vulnerable but also, by chance, central to a scheme that might have been planned simply to destabilize. The question, in the simmering days that followed, was what would be done with that knowledge. The town had to decide whether to act, and more importantly, whether it would inculpate itself by revealing that some residents had been part of a narrative that allowed the monstrous to happen. Then came the night that changed the calculus. An enhanced frame from the diner camera, a grainy, ghost-like series of photographs that had been cross-referenced with a cell phone ping showed a silhouette at the curb that bore a particular gait, a limp that matched a nearby local thug known to be an occasional driver from Malone. The image, when contrasted against a clearer shot from a different camera on a back street, matched clothing and a distinctive scratch on the left wrist. The detective called it a break. For some in the town, it was the first taste of vindication. But justice, in such places, rarely comes without cost. The man who was identified did not fall quietly into a confession. He was the sort who had been paid for small cruelties before. He saw the investigation as a cost of doing business. When the detectives moved to arrest and the first handcuffs clicked, there was a spray of retaliation, a tire flattened, a window smashed, and a threatening note left under a porch light. Marcel Malone responded not with apology but with intimidation. He made it clear that his web was not yet severed. In a private hospital room, June lay between the learning of silences and the ache of recovery. Her body had been ravaged, and in that ravage something unspooled in her spirit. She was a different person, quieter in some ways and yet more galvanic in others. She listened to the reports of the detectives and found herself not merely the center of pity but the axis of a story of moral consequence. She had been unwillingly made a symbol, and in symbols people find both comfort and cruelty. She vowed, with the slow, steady oath of someone waking into a new life, to survive, to be part of the truth that would not be hidden. The town's gossip boiled, but the real work was done in the offices of the police, in courtrooms, in the small, wrenching conversations families had when they realized how delicate the scaffolding of their lives had been. Vanessa, caught between loyalty to the past and the allure of a new life, faced a private collapse. Joey felt pressure from both legal channels and from Marcel, who told him that men who leave obligations unpaid become dangerous. Doug was left to confront the fact that his mistakes had become someone else's crimes as well. For what is the difference, in the end, between self-destruction and being used as an instrument? And then, in a dim meeting room with no fanfare, the police played back the grainy video full screen for the assembled family. They showed the hand reaching near the wheel. They showed the figure at the curb. For all its fuzziness, the image made the air in the room thin. The detective's voice was low and without triumph. "We can't say every detail," he told them, "but we have enough to pick up the trail." The family looked at one another, each carrying an inner ledger of guilt and love. June, pale and still fragile, felt something like vindication, but it was not joy. It was the beginning of a long, hard process. The days that followed were tender and brutal. June's recovery was a messy gradation of improvement and setback. She learned to walk again, the small coiling progress that becomes a new habit. Samantha, who had saved her, became both nurse and prosecutor in her female chamber of the heart. Doug, seeing the results of what he had done, sought forgiveness in a succession of small, pained apologies that had to be earned and never fully repaid. The legal wheels turned, slow and inexorable. Joey found his empire under pressure, and Vanessa found herself caught like a moth in a stormy web.